On the night his wife left him, the Duke of Ravensmore lit her lamp anyway. It was past 11 when he came up the east stairs, as he had come every night for more than 300 nights, carrying the taper in a hand that did not shake because he had spent a lifetime teaching it not to. The corridor was dark and smelled of beeswax and rain. Her door stood open. That was the first wrong thing, because in 14 months that door had never once stood open at 11 o'clock, and through it he could see a room that had surrendered, the wardrobe empty with its doors wide, the dressing table bare, the bed smooth as snowfall, and on the desk, squared to the corner with a bookkeeper's precision, the household keys laid out in a labelled row beside 2 folded lines of paper that he could not, for the moment, bring himself to cross the room and read. And the lamp. The little brass lamp on its bracket beside her door, the one no servant in that great house had been permitted to touch for over a year, on his own strict and unexplained order, stood cold. She had snuffed it herself before she went. The snuffer was set down beside it, neatly, the way she set everything down, and the wick was black. And the man who owned half the county stood in the dark of his own corridor and looked at that small dead lamp for a very long time. And then the 6th Duke of Ravensmore, who 3 days before had turned his back on this woman in front of 200 guests and told the room their marriage was paper, tipped his taper and lit the lamp, and stood watching the flame take hold alone at the door of an empty room. Because some habits are habits, and some are prayers, and by the time a man discovers which one he has been keeping, it is generally late. Hold that picture. A cold room, a burning lamp, and the proudest man in the county keeping a vow no one had ever heard him make. Now, before we go back and learn how a marriage that began as a signature ended standing in that dark corridor, let me ask what I always ask. If stories of quiet love and quiet dignity are what brought you to our fireside tonight, be certain you are subscribed, press the like so this story finds the ones who need it, and tell us in the comments what city or country you are listening from, because we read every one of them each morning. And stay with me to the end, because there is a forged letter in this story, and a child's drawing left on a staircase, and a contract that meets a candle flame. And when you finally understand who lit that lamp and what it cost him to keep lighting it, I promise you will look differently at every small, silent kindness anyone has ever done you. Now then, let us take you back to the beginning. Charlotte Whitfield was 23 the winter her father's world fell down, and she was the one who caught it. Edmund Whitfield had been a corn merchant of the honest middling kind, a widower who had raised his only daughter on ledgers and long walks, and if the neighbourhood thought it eccentric that he taught the girl double-entry bookkeeping and let her manage his warehouse accounts from the age of 16, the neighbourhood was also quietly aware that Whitfield's books were the cleanest in 3 market towns, and drew its own conclusions. Then the county bank failed, taking honest men's deposits down with speculators' dreams, and Edmund Whitfield, who had guaranteed a friend's note besides, found himself at 60 owing what he could not pay, with his warehouse mortgaged and the house behind it, and something went wrong in his chest that winter that never afterward went entirely right. It was Charlotte who sat up with the creditors' letters, who sold what could be sold, who kept her father from signing away the little that remained to a compounder of debts with kind eyes and criminal interest, and who wrote out, in her fair strong hand, an exact and unflinching schedule of everything owed to everyone, because her father had taught her that the beginning of honour his arithmetic, and she would not let his name die crooked, even if it had to die poor. I tell you all this so that you will understand precisely what the Duke of Ravensmore was buying, though he did not know it, when he came to buy. He came in February, unannounced, a tall, cold man of 35, who was the largest of the Whitfield creditors twice over, having held the paper on the warehouse without much noticing among his affairs, and who had, that winter, his own arithmetic to settle. The county had been laying siege to him for 2 years, since the first Duchess of Ravensmore died, and he had concluded, with the grim efficiency of a man deciding to have a tooth out, that the only way to end the campaign of daughters was to marry once, finally, on terms that could never injure him. Terms with no love in them anywhere, for anyone to counterfeit. His lawyer had drawn a list of suitable and impoverished gentlewomen, and Charlotte's name was on it because her mother had been a baronet's granddaughter and her father's ruin was fresh and totally respectable. And so the Duke of Ravensmore sat in the Whitfields' cold little parlour, where the good furniture had already been sold and the fire was economical, and made his offer to her father as though negotiating for standing timber, and her father, grey in the face, sent for Charlotte, because he had never in his life disposed of anything of hers without her, and was not going to begin with her whole future. And the Duke, mildly irritated, found himself repeating the offer to a straight-backed young woman with ink on her middle finger, who heard him all the way through without once looking away, which people rarely did. The debts discharged in full, her father secured in the house for his lifetime with an annuity, and in return a duchess for Ravensmore, to manage his household, sit at his table, and end the county's speculation. And then, because he believed cruelty at the outset was a kind of honesty, and because something about her steadiness unsettled him into saying it more plainly than he had planned, he added the sentence that gives our story its name. "Understand me, Miss Whitfield," he said. "This marriage is paper, nothing more. I have had the other kind, and I will not have it again. If you want love, refuse me. If you can live on truth and a signature, your father sleeps without creditors from tonight." The room was quiet. Her father would not meet her eyes, and his hands, she saw, were trembling, and it was the sight of those hands, the hands that had held the pencil that taught her sums, that decided it, though what she said levelly. "Then we understand each other. Your Grace, I have kept honest books my whole life. I can keep this one." And if he felt, at that sentence, the smallest tremor along an armour he believed complete, he set it down to satisfaction at business well concluded, and was gone within the quarter hour, and they were married in March, in a church with more stone than congregation, before her father, his aunt, his lawyer, and God. And the bride wore grey, and the county, cheated of its campaign and its spectacle both at once, retired to its drawing-rooms to await, with confidence, the marriage's unhappiness. Ravensmore Hall received its new mistress the way a frozen pond receives a stone, with one hard knock and no ripples. It was a great grey house of 100 rooms, with fires lit in 6 of them, run to perfection by a staff who moved like people in a museum, and had learned over 2 long years that his Grace preferred his dinners silent, his doors closed, and his past unmentioned. On her first evening, dining with her new husband down 12 feet of mahogany, Charlotte made 3 attempts at conversation, which struck the polished surface of the Duke's civility and slid off. And it was during the 3rd, wanting nothing but to fill the silence with something human, that she told the story I most need you to remember tonight. Her father, she said, had a custom. In the years he travelled for the business, her mother kept a lamp burning in the parlour window every night he was from home, so that whatever hour he came over the hill, he would see it and know he was waited for, and after her mother died, her father took up the lamp himself and lit it every evening at dusk in that same window for the rest of his life. She had asked him once, being young and cruel the way children are accidentally cruel, why he lit a lamp for somebody who was never coming home, and he had looked at it a while and said, "A lit lamp means someone is waiting for you. I am not going to stop knowing it just because she has gone ahead." The Duke did not look up from his plate. He said after a silence that it was a touching custom, in a voice that filed it under sentiment and rang for the next course, and Charlotte understood that she had handed something precious across that table and watched it be set aside like a dish, and she did not hand him anything else for a long time. What she did instead, because she was her father's daughter, was work and watch and keep her columns straight. And in her first month she took the measure of the house's cold and began quietly to trace it to its source, because a house is a ledger too, and this one had a wound in it where an entry had been torn out. There were no portraits of the first Duchess anywhere below the attics. There was a locked room at the end of the west gallery that the maids would not walk past alone at dusk. "Not for fear of ghosts, Mrs. Bramwell," the housekeeper said shortly, but because his Grace had been found in there once, at 3 in the morning, sitting on the floor with a box of letters, and no one who saw his face that night cared to risk seeing it again. Her name had been Isabel. She had been a beauty of the first rank, and the young Duke, who was in those days capable of joy, had loved her to the edge of foolishness, and believed himself loved. She died in the 3rd winter of the marriage, and the Duke, sorting her effects himself because he could not bear a servant to do it, had found in the false bottom of her writing desk the letters she had exchanged for all 3 years with the man she had actually loved. Letters in which the Duke's devotion was a standing joke with a pet name, his wedding gifts valued to the guinea, and his rush home from Vienna to surprise her on her birthday, described to her lover as the tiresome return of the paymaster. He was 31 years old when he read them. He burned them the same night, and buried her with full honours, and never spoke one word of it to a living soul. And the county, which knew nothing, called his frozen grief devotion. And only 2 people in the world understood what had actually died in that house, and one of them was the Duke, and the other, my friends, was the dead woman's elder sister. Remember her now, because she is coming. Lady Sylvia Ashworth had been the clever sister, the plain sister, the one who watched from the wall while Isabel gathered the room, and she had conceived. In the years of her sister's marriage, a project that was almost reasonable when the beautiful fool ruined herself, as she must, the Duke would need a wife of sense, and there would be Sylvia. Established, sympathetic, near, she had waited through the marriage, and waited, decently veiled, through the mourning, making herself indispensable to the dowager aunt, Lady Agatha, a fixture of the place with her own preferred bedroom and her own chair by the fire. She knew, from a maid she paid, about the box of letters, and she was the only soul alive who knew that piece of the Duke's heart, and she held it the way a general holds a map of the enemy's works. And then the paymaster's carriage went to a bankrupt corn merchant's daughter with ink on her finger, and the project of Lady Sylvia's life fell into ruin at a stroke, and she arrived at Ravensmoor within the month of the wedding, wreathed in smiles, to embrace her dear new sister and take up residence. And I want to say plainly, because this channel deals honestly with you, what Sylvia felt was real grief, of its twisted kind, and real injustice, of its imaginary kind, and none of it will excuse what she did with them. So there is the board, and here are the days. The Duke rode out early, and shut himself with his steward and his papers, and was courteous to his wife at dinner the way one is courteous to an ambassador from a country one has no intention of visiting. Sylvia poured tea and made small, soft observations that always weighed more than they measured. How brave dear Charlotte was to take on such a house with no experience of houses. How well grey became her, though of course it became poor Isabel better. And Charlotte, who had balanced books against sharper practice than Sylvia's, declined every offered battle with a level pleasantness that gave the performance nothing to feed on, and went on working. It was Charlotte who found, in her second month, that the under-steward had for years been shading the coal accounts and the tenants' repair fund, not grandly but steadily. And rather than make a scene of a man's ruin, she laid the corrected columns before the Duke without one word of triumph. And the Duke, going over her figures at midnight and finding them not merely right but elegant, sat looking at her handwriting a long moment before he sent the man away and gave his wife the estate's books entire. It was Charlotte who learned that Pierce the old butler was going deaf in his left ear and terrified for his place, and thereafter contrived to stand always at his right hand when instructions were given, so smoothly that even Pierce took a month to understand it, and wept in his pantry when he did. It was Charlotte who noticed that a fat, neglected spaniel called Pudding, who had been Isabel's in the way that ornaments are somebody's and had belonged to no one since, was taken on no walks by anybody, and began to take him herself, every afternoon, rain or fine, until the sight of the new Duchess crossing the park with that absurd rolling dog became the first thing anyone at Ravensmoor could remember smiling about in 2 years. And it was Charlotte, on her third Sunday, who followed the sound of a child reading aloud to herself and found the nursery. Nobody had told her about Sophie. That is the exact truth, and it tells you everything about what Ravensmoor had become. The Duke's brother had gone down with his ship off Lisbon 4 years before. His wife had not survived the birth that followed the news, and their daughter, 7 years old now, lived at the top of the great house with a nursemaid, a shelf of primers, and a view of the carriage drive, and her uncle, who paid meticulously for everything she could need and could not bear to look at her because she had her father's eyes, visited twice a year, by appointment, like a solicitor. Charlotte stood in that nursery doorway, and the small girl looked up from her book with wary, hoping eyes. The eyes of a child who has learned that grown people mostly come upstairs to leave again, and something in Charlotte's chest, which had held through a bank failure, a father's ruin, and a paper wedding, quietly gave way. She came back the next day, and the day after, and she did not announce it or ask leave. She simply began to be there, the way spring begins. And by June the nursery had maps on its walls, and a kitten in a basket, and arithmetic taught with dried beans, and gales of smothered laughter that made the housemaids on the floor below stop and look at one another. And a small girl who had eaten alone for 4 years now ate her supper at the Duchess's side, and had begun, cautiously, magnificently, to leave her drawings where people would find them. on window seats, on side tables, and once, folded like a state secret, on the third step of the great staircase, where the Duke himself would have to pass. The lamp began on an ordinary Tuesday in her 5th week, and if this story has begun to settle into your heart the way it settled into mine, spare 1 second for the like button and be sure you are subscribed. Because you are about to watch a frozen man do the one warm thing he knows how to do. And I want the whole fireside here for it. Charlotte had gone up early with a headache, and when she reached her corridor in the autumn dark there was light where no light had been. A small brass lamp, newly mounted on a bracket beside her door, trimmed and burning steady, holding back the dark of that long cold passage like a hand held out. She assumed the household had thought of it, and in the morning she thanked Mrs. Bramwell for the kindness. And Mrs. Bramwell, that excellent granite woman, paused in a way that was very slightly too long, and said that no order about a lamp had passed through her, madam, and that she would inquire, and came back the next day with a face wiped carefully blank, to report that it seemed to be attended to, madam, and would be attended to henceforth. And Charlotte, sensing one of those below-stairs arrangements that a wise mistress does not disturb, let it rest. What she could not know, and what I will tell you now, because our fireside keeps no secrets from each other, only from the people in the story, is this. The lamp was lit every evening at dusk by the Duke of Ravensmore with his own hand, and by his strict order no servant was to touch it, trim it, fill it, or speak of it on their places. The footman knew, the maids knew, Pierce knew, and Mrs. Bramwell knew within the day, because nothing true in a great house stays hidden from its kitchen, and not one of them ever breathed it, partly because their master had ordered silence, and mostly because every soul below stairs understood they were watching something it would be a kind of sacrilege to interrupt. A man who had had love counterfeited to his face, who could not say a warm word across 12 feet of mahogany, walking up the east stairs every evening of the world with a taper, to tell a woman who would never know it was him that somebody was waiting for her. He had heard the story at that first silent dinner after all. It had gone straight through the armour at the first try, the corn merchant lighting his lamp for a dead wife, because he was not going to stop knowing something just because she was gone. And the Duke had sat there sawing at his fish while a sentence he had no defences against took up residence in his chest. A lit lamp means someone is waiting for you. He had the bracket mounted while she was walking the dog. He told himself that first Tuesday that it was courtesy, a dark corridor, a new wife, a house's plain duty, and perhaps on Tuesday it was, but he came again on Wednesday, and on Thursday, and by the frosts of November it had stopped being anything he had a name for, and this is the whole of him. He could not say it, he could not show it at dinner, he could not risk it in daylight where a face might do to him what a face had done before, but every single night, in the dark, where no one could see him give, and no one could pretend to receive. The Duke of Ravensmore told his wife the truth. And the winter, without either of them ever naming it, began slowly to thaw. He took to bringing his papers, some evenings, to the small library where she kept the estate books, on the stated grounds that the fire there drew better, and they would work at opposite ends of the long table in a silence with company in it. He found himself asking his wife's opinion of the drainage scheme for the Low Farms, and receiving, with the fish, an answer so exact and so quietly funny about the engineer's estimates that he laughed before he remembered he did not do that. A short, rusty sound that made a footman nearly drop the sauce and made Lady Sylvia down the table go very still. He began, on no stated grounds at all, to pause on the third step of the great staircase, where the folded drawings were left, and to take them up and look at them a long time, stick figures with crowns, a lady, a child, a fat dog, a tall scowling man always drawn a little apart from the others, and once, only once, a version where the tall man's stick hand and the lady's stick hand were joined. And that one did not go into the fire with his other papers, that one went into the drawer of his desk and stayed there. And in January, Sophie fell ill. It came on in a night. The fever that every parent in every century has feared, the child burning and wandering, asking for her father who was under the sea. And the physician came and looked grave and spoke of crisis and said what physicians said in those days, which was nothing. Kindly Charlotte did not leave the nursery for 3 days and the better part of 3 nights. She held the child through the shaking fits, she changed the soaked linen, she sang in a low cracked voice every song her own mother had left her, and somewhere past 2 on the second morning the nursery door opened, and the Duke of Ravensmore stood in it, in his shirt, with no candle. A man who visited this room twice a year by appointment, and he did not say anything. And she did not say anything, and he sat down in the small wooden chair on the other side of the small bed, absurd and enormous, and took his brother's daughter's burning hand as if it might go off, and stayed. They fought for her together through the worst of it, passing the basin, spelling each other in the singing. 2 people who could not talk to one another, talking all night to a delirious child, and just before dawn on the 3rd day the fever broke, all at once, into sweat and quiet and ordinary breathing, and Sophie turned over into true sleep, holding both their hands. One small fist on each, so that neither of them could move. And they sat there in the grey light, joined through a sleeping child, and Charlotte looked across the bed at her husband's wrecked, unguarded face, and understood with perfect clarity that she loved him, and had for some time, and the Duke looked back at his wife, hollow-eyed, hair on end, more beautiful to him than anything he had ever bought or buried, and came nearer to saying so than he had come in 6 years. He did not say it. You know why? You have read his reasons in a false-bottomed drawer. But from that morning the ice was visibly going, the staff walked lighter, pudding was permitted at breakfast, and his Grace was heard, one shocking Thursday, whistling on the terrace, and no one watched the melt with a more expert and terrified eye than Lady Sylvia Ashworth, who had seen precisely this weather once before, in the courtship of her sister, and who understood that she was watching the last of her life's purpose disappearing into the spring. And here I must slow down, because what she did next she did carefully, and you deserve to see every stitch of it. Sylvia had 2 possessions that no one else on this earth had. She had the knowledge of the letters, the exact shape of the wound, the pet name, the paymaster, every detail her paid maid had gleaned, and she had hoarded 6 years. And she had the freedom of a resident intimate in every unlocked room in Ravensmore, including the writing desk where the Duchess kept her estate correspondence, her pens and her blotting book, that innocent domestic object which took, in mirror image, a ghost of every line the Duchess's strong fair hand set down. Through February and March, Patiently, Lady Sylvia borrowed that blotting book page by page and taught herself, tracing by candlelight in her locked room with the shutters fast, to write the Duchess of Ravensmore's hand. She practiced the capitals for a week and the signature for a fortnight, and then, on paper she was too clever to buy new, she composed the letter, addressed to a Lieutenant Fenn, a name she invented with care, a half-pay officer of no regiment anyone could check. And into it she poured, in Charlotte's own borrowed handwriting, every poisoned phrase her dead sister had actually written 6 years before, phrases she knew the Duke had read once at 3 in the morning and could never unread. The paymaster, my tiresome Duke. The devotion that is a standing joke between us. She sealed it, scuffed it as letters scuff in carrying, and held it back, waiting, like the good general she was, for the hour of maximum audience. And the hour was coming, printed and gilt-edged, because Ravensmore Hall had announced for the last week of April the first ball it had given in 6 years, in honour, though the cards did not say so, of nothing at all, except that its master had remembered how to whistle, and the whole county was coming to see the thaw. The night of the ball, Ravensmore blazed the way a house blazes when it is trying to make up 6 dark years in one evening, and for the first hours it succeeded. The county came half in curiosity and stayed wholly in astonishment, because the frozen Duke stood at the head of his own stairs with his Duchess and welcomed people warmly by name. He had asked her that morning, stiffly, magnificently, like a man translating out of a dead language, whether she would do him the honour of opening the ball with him, and she had said yes gravely, and then spoiled it with the sunrise of a smile she could not hold back. And he had bowed and retreated in disorder, and the entire household had pretended very hard not to have seen. That first dance was promised, and the promise ran ahead of the evening like light. And at 10:30, while the Duchess was at the far end of the long gallery being gracious to the vicar's mother, a footman, newly hired that quarter, whose wages, we may as well say now, were being doubled from a purse that was not the Duke's, put into his Grace's hand a letter. "Madams," he murmured, found fallen behind the writing desk in the small library when the extra candles were fetched, and was gone into the crowd. The Duke stood by the window with the letter, meaning to pocket it for her. He would tell himself afterward in the wreckage that he had not meant to look, but the direction was in her hand, and the name on it was a man's name he did not know, and a cold thread, he believed, cut forever, pulled tight in his chest. And he broke the seal. And beside the great window of his own bright ballroom, with his guests laughing behind him, the Duke of Ravensmore read, in his wife's handwriting, his first wife's letter. That is what Sylvia had built, and I want you to see how fiendishly well she had built it. Every phrase that letter needed was a phrase he could confirm against his own scalded memory. The paymaster, the tiresome Duke, the devotion that is our standing joke. Word for word the wounds matched, and so he did what she had known for 6 years he would do. He stopped weighing evidence and started bleeding. It did not occur to him that only one living person had also read those first letters, or that the paper, had he held it to the light, carried the watermark of a stationer her purse had never once patronized, or that Charlotte Whitfield, who spelled like a lawyer's clerk, would not in delirium have written receive. Nothing occurred to him. That is what a wound is, my friends. It is the place where thinking stops. He stood by the window perhaps 4 minutes. Then he folded the letter with terrible neatness and put it in his breast, and walked back into the light of his ball with a face the older servants recognized with a dropping of the stomach. The 3 in the morning face, the face from the West Gallery, and the musicians raised their bows for the opening set. And the Duchess of Ravensmore came down the gallery toward her husband, glowing, her hand already lifting for the dance he had begged of her that morning. And before 200 witnesses, the Duke of Ravensmore looked at his wife's offered hand and turned his back. He turned his back and offered his arm instead to Lady Sylvia Ashworth, and said in a voice he did not trouble to lower, pitched in fact with cruel exactness for the rings of listeners all around, that Lady Sylvia would do him the honour, and that her Grace would forgive him. For she of all women understood the terms of this house. "Our marriage is paper, madam," he said over his shoulder into the spreading hush. "You would do well to remember that paper is all it will ever be. Freeze it there, because this channel has shown you many frozen ballrooms, but never one like this. The violins hanging unplayed at the first note, the vicar's mother with her glass at her lip, 200 faces turning like a field of wheat, not toward power this time, but toward its victim, toward the woman in dove grey standing alone in the centre of the floor she was to have opened, her hands still half lifted for a dance that had left without her, and Sylvia on the Duke's arm with her eyes cast decently down, wearing the small sorrowful smile of a woman being brave about being right. 6 years of patience paying out at last before the largest audience the county could assemble. And Charlotte. Look at her, because this is why we tell her story. She stood quite still for the length of one long breath. Whatever broke in her, and something broke, we will not pretend otherwise, it made no sound that any of those 200 people ever heard. Then she lowered her hand smoothly, as though she had raised it to adjust her glove, and she curtsied to her husband's back, the full, deep, formal curtsy owed to a duke by a stranger, and said, in a voice that carried exactly as far as his had, and not 1 inch farther, "As you wish, your Grace." And she turned, unhurried, her head level, and walked the whole length of that gallery through the parted silent crowd, nodding good evening to the guests she passed as though the evening were hers, and was gone up the great staircase without once quickening. And only 2 beings in that glittering house followed her, a fat spaniel who left the buffet, which those who knew pudding agreed was unprecedented, and the eyes of every servant in the room. She did not weep that night, or if she did, the morning showed no sign of it. What she did was work, one last time, and I will give you the inventory, because her leaving deserves to be witnessed item by item. She sat at her desk through the small hours and balanced the estate books to the very day, ruled off, and wrote in the margin a neat schedule of the quarter's obligations falling due. She laid out the household keys in their labelled row. She took off the Ravensmore diamonds she had worn that evening and set them in their case, and with them every jewel, every gift, everything the contract had bought, keeping back only what she had brought. Her mother's thin ring, her father's pencil, and the small valise she had carried up those stairs 14 months before. She wrote 2 lines, no more, and folded them once. I will read them to you at the proper time. And at first light, in her plain travelling dress, she stopped at her own door, where the little brass lamp still burned faithfully from the night before, that small, constant light she had never solved, and had come, without knowing why, to steady herself by, and she looked at it a long moment, and then, because she would not leave a flame burning in an empty room to no purpose, she snuffed it gently herself, and set the snuffer down beside it, squared, and went down the east stairs and out of Ravensmoor Hall on foot to meet the carrier's morning cart, and the only person she passed was Susan, her maid, standing in the cold of the side door, with a face full of everything forbidden to say, and Charlotte pressed her hand and said, "Take care of Sophie till she wakes," and was gone up the road in the grey of the morning, dry-eyed, straight-backed, owning almost nothing, exactly as she had come. And if you are asking where a woman goes who has been shamed before a county with a ruined father in a mortgaged house, I will tell you. She goes home, and she takes the wound with the debts, and she goes to work. Within the week she was keeping books again in the market town, first for the corn factor who had known her father 40 years, then for the draper, then for the brewery, her table by the window, her columns straight, her father's name standing a little taller on that street, with every squared account, and if her nights, in the narrow bed of her girlhood, had in them a certain darkness at the top of the stairs where no lamp burned, she told no one, and rose each morning and ruled her line and carried on, because that is what her kind does. And because she did not yet know, poor bookkeeper, that far away in a great grey house her leaving had knocked the pin out of everything, and the whole cold structure of the Duke of Ravensmoor's certainties had already begun, beam by beam, to come down. The 2 lines she left said this: "Your Grace, the books are balanced to today, and the keys are labelled. You were honest with me at the beginning, and I have been honest with you throughout. I ask only that you tell the child it was not her fault." He read them standing in that empty room at 11 at night, after he had lit the lamp, and then he read them again. And it was the last line that got in under the armour, because a woman who had just been destroyed in front of 200 people had thought, first and only, of a 7-year-old asleep at the top of the house. Guilty women do not write that line. Guilty women explain. That was the first stone out of the wall, and the wall came down over 11 days. It came down because Ravensmoor without her went wrong in the way a clock goes wrong, quietly and completely. The staff performed their duties like people at a funeral. Pierce, who had not disobeyed an order in 50 years, was found by the Duke standing at the door of the small library, and when his master, sleepless and savage, demanded to know what he wanted, the old man drew himself up and said that in 50 years he had never spoken out of his place, and would speak now if it cost him it, that no letter had fallen behind that desk, Your Grace, for he had moved that desk himself for the candles and swept behind it, and that the footman who carried it up had left on the Monday after, without notice, and without collecting his wages. "Wages?" said Mrs. Bramwell, coming in behind him like weather, that a girl in the laundry could tell his Grace had been paid twice over from another hand, and Thomas the footman, 20 years old and shaking like a leaf in a gale, stood in that library and told the Duke of Ravensmoor that on the 11th of March he had seen Lady Sylvia come out of the small library at an hour when the family were at dinner, with the Duchess's blotting book under her shawl, and that he had said nothing at the time, because who is a footman to say anything, and had not slept well since. And Pudding, the fat spaniel, who understood none of it, had taken up a position on the 3rd step of the great staircase facing the door, where he lay for 11 days and would not be moved, and rose to hope at every carriage on the drive, and lay down again, And of everything in that house it was the dog on the stairs that the servants afterwards said broke their master. But before any of them, before Pierce, before Thomas, before the dog, it was the child. Sophie came down to the library on the second morning in her nightgown, having escaped her nurse, and stood in the door until her uncle looked up and asked him the question no adult in that county would have dared ask, which is what children are for. "Where is Charlotte?" she said. And when he could not answer, she asked the plain one, the one that went through him like a lance, "Did you send her away because I was ill and it cost too much money?" And the Duke of Ravensmore got down on the floor of his library in front of a 7-year-old and told her no, and told her it was not her fault, exactly as his wife had asked him to, and heard himself keeping the only promise she had asked of him while having broken every other, and when the child had gone he stayed down there a long time. Then he got up and unlocked the drawer and took out the letter and did what he should have done by the window at the ball. He read it as a man reads a document, with the candle and the ledgers and his wife's real handwriting spread out beside it, and it took him under 4 minutes. The hand was too careful. Her real capitals ran. This one drew. The paper was watermarked from a stationer whose bills had never once crossed the household accounts he now knew by heart. The regiment was fictitious. He had the army list in his own library, and Lieutenant Fenn was in no line of it. And in the 4th paragraph, in a woman who had never misspelled a word in 14 months of estate correspondence, receive 4 minutes. It had taken him 4 minutes by that window to condemn her, and 4 minutes at that desk to clear her, and the difference between them was that in the first he had been afraid. And there is the whole of it, that is the sentence I want carved on this story. He had not read what was written. He had read what he feared. He went up to the West Gallery and unlocked that room and understood at last whose voice was really in that forged letter, and who in this world had known it well enough to counterfeit it. And then he came down and sent for Lady Agatha and for Lady Sylvia Ashworth, and the reckoning that followed was so quiet that a servant outside the door heard mostly the fire. He did not shout. He laid the forgery on the table beside the blotting book, and Thomas's testimony, and the watermark, and the army list, and the laundry girl's account of the doubled wages, in the order a bookkeeper would have used, which is a thing he noticed himself doing and nearly broke on, and he watched his dead wife's sister look at that little pile of paper and understand that the campaign of her life had ended. She tried, briefly, to be brave about it. She said the words a person says, that she had done it for him, that the Whitfield girl was beneath him, that she had saved him from a second humiliation that Isabel would have wanted, and it was there that Lady Agatha, 78 years old and complicit in 1,000 small cruelties of coldness in that house, rose out of her chair and said, "Be silent," and turned to her nephew and said, in front of the woman, that she herself had watched a good girl carry that house for 14 months, and had never once said so aloud, and would be ashamed of it privately for whatever time she had left. Sylvia went north within the week to a relation in Fife on an allowance the Duke settled with the cold thoroughness of a man closing a wound, on the single condition that she never again come south of the Tweed, and she kept to it, and lived a long time, and was received nowhere that mattered, and the county, which never learned the details, simply and permanently stopped including her name in things. That is how it ends for such people, not in fire, but in a small dull room, with the audience gone. There is one more thing he learned before he went to her, and it is the thing that finally made a fool of all his silence. Mrs. Bramwell asked whether the Duchess had ever inquired about the lamp, told him that Madam had asked once in her 5th week and had thanked the housekeeper for the kindness, and had been told the truth was not the housekeeper's to give, and had never asked again. Never knew, said the Duke. 14 months. She never knew it was me. No, Your Grace, said Mrs. Bramwell. She thought it was the house being kind to her, and she was grateful to the house. And I will tell you plainly that the greatest of the Duke of Ravensmore's follies was not the letter and not the ball. It was 390 nights of loving a woman in the dark where she could not see it, and calling that honesty. So he went to fetch her, and here is where the man finally earns the ending. Because he did it right. No carriage with a crest, no lawyer, no settlement, no letter sent ahead. He came into that market town on a Tuesday in a plain brown coat with the mud of 40 miles on him, and he stood in the street outside the corn factor's office until she came out at 6 with her cash box under her arm, and when she saw him she stopped as though she had walked into glass. He did not touch her. He said her name, and then said the thing he had ridden 2 days to say, and he said it without one excuse in it, because that, at last, he had learned. I read what I feared, he said, and not what was written. There is no fault of yours anywhere in this. I turned my back on you in front of 200 people because 6 years ago a woman taught me to be a coward, and I let her teach me. And I have gone on being one every day of our marriage in ways you never even saw. I am not here to ask anything of you tonight. I am here so that the same county that watched me do it will watch me stand in this street. And then he bowed to her, in the middle of a market town in a muddy coat, before the corn factor's clerks and 2 carters and the whole of the King Street evening. And he took a room at the inn, and stayed a week, and came back the next week, and the next, on foot, asking nothing, sitting in her father's parlour, talking to a sick old man about drainage and Defoe with real attention, walking her to her office in the mornings when she permitted it, being told no, and coming back until the market town, which had begun by hating him thoroughly on her behalf, was by the 5th week unashamedly on his side, and openly betting on it. And still she did not go back with him, and I want you to understand exactly why, because this is the part of the story I would fight for. It was not pride, and it was not punishment. It was arithmetic. She had been bought once, by contract, for her father's debts, and she had lived 14 months inside an agreement that permitted a man to turn his back on her in public and be technically within his rights, and she was not going to re-enter that house on any terms that could ever do it again. If she went back, the going back had to be a different document altogether, or, better, no document at all. She said as much to Susan, her maid, who had left Ravensmore within the month of her mistress and turned up at the Whitfield door with her box and a flat refusal to be sent away, and who had all this time been sitting on a piece of knowledge like a hen on an egg, having been sworn by Mrs. Bramwell, but never, as she pointed out to herself with enormous satisfaction, by his Grace directly. And so on a wet evening in the 6th week, watching her mistress sit at the window with her ledger closed, unseeing, Susan put down the kettle and said, "Ma'am, I am about to lose my place twice over, and I do not care. The lamp at your door at Ravensmore. You never knew who lit it." Charlotte said, "The house." And Susan said, "No, ma'am. It was his grace. Every night, with his own hand, at dusk, from your 5th week to the night you left, and none of us was allowed to touch it, on our places, and he never told you. And I have watched him ride 40 miles in the rain to stand in a street for you, and I will not sit in this kitchen and let you not know it. Charlotte did not say anything at all. She sat with her hand flat on the closed ledger, and Susan, who told this story for the next 40 years and never once improved it because it did not need improving, said that her mistress's face did what a frozen river does in March. Every silent dinner rearranged itself. Every one of those 390 nights, that small steady flame outside her door that she had walked toward, tired, through 14 months of a house that did not love her. He came on the Sunday in the plain coat, and he did not come empty-handed this time, and what he carried 40 miles wrapped in cloth was the little brass lamp from the bracket beside her door and a tinderbox. He lit it in her father's parlour at dusk with the same hand that had lit it for 390 nights, and set it in the window, and said, "You told me on the first night of our marriage what a lit lamp means." I did not answer you. I have been answering you every night since in the dark like a coward, and I find I cannot bear that you did not know. And then he took out of his breast pocket the marriage contract, the paper he had made her their entire world, and held it up so she could see what it was, and knelt on her father's worn hearthrug and put it into her fire, and neither of them said a word while it caught and curled and went, and then he said, still kneeling, "There is nothing left between us now but what we say to each other out loud." Charlotte Whitfield rose and crossed her father's parlour and told him her terms, and here they are, because every woman at this fireside has earned the right to hear them said. You will never again decide about me without asking me. If you fear something, you will say it that same day, aloud to my face, however it shames you, and I will do the same, and we will neither of us hoard a single thing to be discovered later. There will be no paper of any kind between us again as long as we live. And she stood over him and finished, in the level voice she had balanced 20 years of books in, and I will not be loved in the dark, Julian. If you love me, you will have to do it where I can see. He said yes to every one of them, the way men say things they intend to be held to for 30 years, and he was. And then she put her hand out and drew him up off her father's hearthrug, and neither of them was very composed for some while after that, and Susan, listening shamelessly at the kitchen door, put the kettle on again and cried into the towels. They went home together on the Thursday, and they went home slowly, and by her arrangement, not his, not a swift closed carriage in the dark, but an open one on a fine morning, up the length of the market town's main street, where every clerk and carter who had watched him stand in the mud had a right to see the end of the story, and then the 40 miles home. And Edmund Whitfield came with them, out of the mortgaged house forever, to a set of south-facing rooms at Ravensmoor, with a garden he could reach on a stick, where he lived 4 more years than any physician had promised him, and died in a chair in the sun in the middle of a conversation, which is the way to do it. The household lined the drive when they came up it, all of them, without being told, and Pierce, who had never in 50 years done anything so improper, applauded, and then the whole line applauded. And Mrs. Bramwell wept with her chin up and denied it afterward for years, and Pudding, at 40 pounds and 11 years of age, came off that third step at a gallop for the first and last time in his life, and hit his Duchess amidships in the gravel, and would not stop shrieking. And Sophie escaped her nurse and came down the great staircase 2 at a time, and was caught halfway by a woman in a travelling dress who sat right down on the stairs with her and did not care in the least what the county thought about duchesses sitting on staircases. The county thought a great deal about it, as it happened, and decided, as counties do, that it had always been on her side. The blessing was said in the village church that June, not the cathedral, and it was not a wedding, since they were married already, and everyone present understood it to be a great deal more binding than the wedding had been. Look down the front pews with me one last time, because our accounts close here. Pierce the butler, on the aisle, deaf in his left ear, and seated deliberately on the right, so that he should miss nothing. Mrs. Bramwell beside him, in a bonnet the Duchess had chosen. Thomas the footman, who had told the truth in a library when it might have cost him his place, and who was married in that same church 3 months later to Susan the maid, the pair of them given the tenancy of the home farm as a wedding gift because, as his Grace observed dryly at the breakfast, this family owes its entire happiness to 2 servants who declined to keep their mouths shut. Lady Agatha, 78, who had said be silent in a cold library, and had spent the winter learning, painfully, to say warmer things, and who left Sophie everything she had. And that same evening, when the guests were gone, a small girl in her nightgown was given by her uncle a taper of her own, and taken up the east stairs and taught the household's only ritual, which she performed every Sunday of her childhood thereafter, and which her own children performed after her. At dusk, the lamp beside the Duchess's door is lit, by the hand of somebody who loves her, and never by a servant, and it burns all night whether she is at home or from home, and if you ask this family why, they will tell you that a lit lamp means someone is waiting for you. In time there were 3 more children in that nursery, and the fat spaniel died full of years on a hearthrug in the sun, and is buried under the beech with a stone that says, without any title on it at all, Pudding. Who knew? The estate books at Ravensmoor were kept for 40 years in a strong fair hand, and its master, who had once bought a wife with a contract, was known throughout that county for the rest of his life as a man who never let the sun go down on an unspoken fear, because he had promised out loud in a parlour in a market town, and had been made to say it where she could see. And so we close the ledger, and here is what it says, and I think you have known it since the first minute of this story. Love is not proven in the ballroom, where 200 people are watching and every gesture is a performance. It is proven in a dark corridor at 11 o'clock at night by a man with a taper, doing a small faithful thing for someone who will never know he did it, 390 times, expecting nothing. Cruelty needs its audience, and it destroyed itself the moment it found one. Kindness needs none, and it was the only thing in that cold house that survived. And paper, my friends, paper burns. Contracts, letters, forgeries, terms, all of it goes up in a minute and leaves nothing behind but a little ash. The light is what keeps. So tell me in the comments tonight who lit a lamp for you when you did not know it. The person who did the quiet, faithful thing you only found out about years later, or never did. Say their name here where we can all see it, because this is where we keep such names. If this story stayed with you, press the like so it can find the ones who need it, subscribe if you have not, and share it with someone who is loving in the dark and has not yet found the courage to be seen doing it. We will see you in the next story.